Ok, buon pomeriggio, grazie a tutti per essere qui e grazie a Castello di Rivoli per aver organizzato questa bella occasione di incontro. E spero possiate scusarmi se faccio la presentazione in inglese perché ho lavorato su documenti originali in inglese, quindi mi viene un pochino più facile. So, I'm gonna present in English. At this point, actually, I either talk with a broken Italian or with a broken English, so it's kind of the same. You would struggle to understand anyhow, but I'll be as clear as possible. So the J. Paul Getty Museum somehow is a very different example compared to some of the examples we saw this morning, in which we have house museums with an installation that is kind of frozen in time, or in which a lot of effort has been put to recreate installations from a specific history. Actually, the museum is fairly recent. It has a little bit more than 60 years of life, but through its life, he went through very dramatic changes, actually, both in his institutional settings, in its collection, and also in the buildings it is housed. So I will briefly go through J. Paul Getty's life and his ideas about the museum and his collection, and we will see all the developments that the institution has lived. So J. Paul Getty was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in 1892. His father, who was an industrialist, in 1903 for the first time struck oil in Oklahoma, and this is the beginning of this enormous wealth in the family. In 1906, the family relocated in Los Angeles, and actually J. Paul Getty did not spend a lot of time in Los Angeles. He spent there his teenage years and then roughly 10 years after the First World War, but he really always considered the city as his hometown. So in 1912, while touring in Asia, Getty acquires two Chinese vases, which he had always considered the very beginning of his collection. But it's important to notice that actually from that point, for almost 20 years actually, he would not buy anything else. The 1910s, 20s, and 30s are really like 3 decades. They are devoted to restless travel, a lot of hard work, and also a pretty tumultuous personal life. He married 5 times in like a little bit more than 15 years. But from the late 1930s, actually his life changes pretty dramatically. He becomes a much more private person, a much more secluded person. He wouldn't travel as much, and he would devote most of his time actually to the building of his collection. So, as I said, it's only from the end of the 1930s that Getty really starts acquiring like museum quality pieces. And from the very beginning, his collection is actually intended to be a collection of few exquisite pieces. He never wanted an encyclopedic collection, and he always made it clear that he would buy only what actually pleased him. For example, in The Joys of Collecting, that it's a book that he published later in the 1960s, he says, and I quote, "I collect paintings that please my taste, and I believe that the collection on display at the Getty Museum is better for the fact that the items in it were selected carefully from examples of the schools and periods I know, understand, and appreciate the most." So particularly in 1938, he tours Europe and buys some great masterpieces. So here, for example, we can see Rembrandt's Martenloten, which is an interesting painting also if we think about the obsession that Getty would develop over time for a specific artwork. In this case, for example, he saw the painting for the very first time in an exhibition in 1928. He was able to acquire it only 10 years later, in 1938. And then 10 years after that, in 1948, he's finally able to clear up from his schedule a couple of months that he would spend in the Netherlands doing research in the archives at the Rijksmuseum and in many actually local town archives in an effort to trying to understand who the sitter was and eventually what this letter that he's holding was about. And I put here also this copy from Raphael, this Holy Family that it's been called also La Madonna di Loreto, La Madonna del Velo. Getty bought it from Sotheby's in the same year for £40. At that time was considered to be a copy of a lost Raphael. Getty from the very beginning was firmly convinced that this was an actual Raphael, and he actually hired a person for more than 10 years to do research on this painting, until the scholars surrounding Getty and himself, they were all convinced that this was an actual Raphael. So from that point onwards, this became really the masterpiece of the museum. Although later on, after his passing, further research has actually confirmed that this is a copy from a Raphael. So Getty's collection focused on three main areas: French decorative arts of the 18th century, and this is really a field in which Getty wrote very extensively, and he was highly regarded as a connoisseur. And then old master paintings, as we saw, and Greek and Roman antiquities. And from his antique collection, I'm just showing this Hercules, just to highlight another main feature of Getty collecting, which is his interest for provenance. He was particularly interested in acquiring pieces that belonged to Roman emperors, in the case of Roman art, or to royal family, European royal families. And in particular, this statue that was digged from Tivoli in 1790, this has been, this is probably the statue that a lot of sources refer to as the favorite statue of the Emperor Adrian. So Getty was particularly pleased to have it, and it's still one of the masterpieces, really, of the museum. So finally getting to the museum, in 1945, Getty acquires this set of buildings that are called the Ranch House in Malibu to house his growing art collection and as a weekend getaway. So although all these buildings are actually from the 1920s, this site appealed to Getty interest in history, because this parcel of land is documented in the 19th century as the Spanish Rancho Boca de Santa Monica, which was a particularly important site because there was some natural springs and fresh water. So as early as 1950, Getty envisioned a museum and a library at his ranch house. But it's also important to notice that actually in 1951, Getty, actually this is Getty in his zoo. He actually built a zoo at the ranch house, which is kind of a typical feature if you build a mansion in California. So in 1951, Getty actually left the US and he relocated in the UK, and he would never come back to the US. So he would never actually see his museum. In 1959, in particular, he purchases Sutton Place in England, which is this 72 rooms English Tudor manor house from 1525. And this will become his permanent residency for the rest of his life. In a pretty surprising move, at the same time while he was setting up the museum at the ranch house, in 1953, he also donated some of his masterpieces to what was then called the Los Angeles Museum of History, Science and Art, that it's now LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And here in particular we have the coronation carpet, which is considered one of the most precious Persian carpet from 16th century in the world, which Getty donated to LACMA and which is now, actually right now, exhibited in the museum. So, meanwhile, Getty converts the ranch house into this two-story Spanish-style residency in which he built a brand new gallery for antiquities. And finally, in 1954, the J. Paul Getty Museum opens in the ranch house. As I said, Getty was not there, and he will never visit this museum. So here we have from the archives at the Getty some images of how the museum looked like in the ranch house. In the old part of the house, there were a series of period rooms, basically with decorative art and furnitures. Then there were a couple of galleries for paintings. And then the brand new part of the newly construction part was actually devoted to tapestries and antiquities. So it was a fairly small museum, and it was really a museum of, somehow a museum of masterpieces. All the pieces were really, really fine. So in 1970, so about 15 years after opening the Ranch House, actually Getty decided to open a new museum in the same property. He is presented with three proposals: a Spanish-style building in the same style of the Ranch House, a neoclassical building, and a modern building of glass, steel, and concrete. He actually rejects all of three and asks for a design based on Villa dei Papiri in Herculaneum that he has visited for the first time in 1912. So here we have an image of J. Paul Getty actually sat on place in front of a model of the new villa. So this is a little, a small catalog, a little leaflet that was published by the museum when the villa first opened in 1974. Interestingly enough, it's called Herculaneum to Malibu. And here I pasted the very first page of the book and the very last page. So the very first page is a reproduction of the map of the floor plan of Villa dei Papiri drawn by Karl Weber, who was the Swiss military engineer directing the excavation at the end of the 18th century on behalf of the King of Naples. So this is the floor plan, the map that Getty used in order to build this villa. And then the book finishes, the very last page is indeed a floor plan of the villa in Malibu. So there's a direct connection between Ercolano and Malibu. Actually, Getty hires for this project a local professor, Norman Neuerburg, who was a professor specialized in Roman architecture, and he was teaching at Cal State Dominguez Hill, close to Los Angeles. And Neuerburg is credited as the designer of the villa, and also he's credited for the installation of the pieces. So at the Getty Research Institute, we actually have all the papers of Neuenburg about the design and the construction of the villa. So here I'm showing just a few documents. Here is a preparatory, basically bibliography of the sources he used to figure out how the villa would have looked like in Roman times, together with some pretty drawings in which he's figuring out architectural details, marble choices, and painting decorations. We actually have also an interview, a video interview that was made at Sutton Place to J. Paul Getty when the villa first opened in 1974. And I'm going to read a few excerpts because I think it's really interesting in understanding what were the intentions of Getty behind building such a rather bizarre project. Getty says, and I quote, "There are two theories about museum. One is that the building and the grounds should not compete with the collection, and of course if you follow that theory to its extremes, you should display your collection in a barn, because the barn would not compete with the artworks. But actually, most artworks were not created to be displayed in museums. They were created as ornaments to a shrine or a temple or a palace, and they look best in their original environment. I think paintings in this room," he was talking from Sutton Place, which was also, of course, filled with art. "I think paintings in this room look better than they would in a museum, because it's obvious that the paintings are where they were created to be, and a Roman villa is very suitable for a collection of Roman and Greek antiquities." And he goes on talking about how it's actually exhausting to visit the Louvre, and how a museum should instead have a very domestic and enclosed quality. It's also interesting to note that if you actually go to the J. Paul Getty website right now, they're really stressing the fact that the villa, it's Roman inspired, but it's not a reconstruction of a Roman villa, which is kind of funny because if you go back to the sources, if you actually read and listen to what Getty was saying, he was really into this attempt to reconstruct a Roman villa, which I think it's pretty interesting and pretty radical in a way. For example, he also said in the same interview, "I'm often asked who's the architect, and I reply, I do not know the name of the architect. He was probably Greek, and he died 2,000 years ago." He also says, "You can go to Herculaneum and see it the way it is now. You can go to Malibu and see it the way it was." So it's really somehow about what we were saying this morning about cortocircuiti spazio-temporali, and this attempt of really bring the public somehow back on time and give this experience of living the life of a Roman somehow. Asked about how to approach his museum, he said, if the visitor has the imagination, he can fancy himself back 2,000 years and call in on some Roman friends of his who live in the villa. And I'm going to quote only one of the gems we have in this archive, which is very funny and really telling, I think. This is a letter. Actually, who sent the letter, I cannot tell because the signature is not legible, but it's someone who was working for this Widnen and Trollope, which was like a quantity survey and cost consulting firm. And they are writing in November 72, so 2 years prior to the opening of the villa, to Stephen Garrett, which was the then director of the museum. And this person says, Dear Stephen, thank you for your letter dating 28th November concerning the problem of making a roof look like 2,000 years old. There are a number of recipes for this, and in fact at Palo, because we were near the sea, the roof, I believe, was sprinkled with fairly liberal applications of salt and cow dung in a fairly liquid form, which produced the required aging effect. I am not sure whether in California they have any real cows, or whether, like most other things, they manufacture their milk artificially. But I am sure that in underdeveloped countries like England, they could provide the necessary ingredients to apply to the roof and stonework of Mr. Getty's 20th century, 1st century villa. I note you suggest dragon's blood, but this is extremely difficult to obtain. So I think it's kind of interesting to think about this notion of artificiality and dragon blood in relation to the villa and in relation to this stereotype that we all have as Los Angeles as a dystopic kind of magic and also ultimately fake place where you can jump from one world to the other and jump from Disneyland to Hollywood and back to reality. Somehow this notion of artificiality, I think, was really the key to the really wide success that the villa had in terms of public, but was also the key for its dramatic dismissal by critics and art historians. Indeed, the villa, though, it's not really a reproduction of Villa dei Papiri, but it's kind of a mix of different sources. So here I'm back to the leaflet, Herculaneum to Malibu, I was quoting before. This is an actual page in which they're just opposing the courtyard of the villa together with the courtyard of a villa in Stabia. And they go very much in detail explaining how, for example, this mural decoration, it's from Villa del Fauno in Pompeii. Instead, this fountain is the reproduction of another fountain which is in another house in Pompeii, La Casa della Grande Fontana, whereas this capital is actually from Herculaneum, from Villa dei Cervi. So there are different sources, all from the same area. I'm showing here a few of the very rare installation shots of how the villa looked like at that time. These are taken actually from the video interview. So downstairs there were the antiquities, and then upstairs again Getty set up these period rooms. So we get to another level of artificiality because the Roman setting is completely muted, and you have instead the reproduction of this like French living spaces. So. J. Paul Getty dies in 1976, and although he had consistently cautioned the museum staff that the institution would have to survive on the original endowment he had provided, he actually left in his will virtually his entire estate to the institution, giving it the greater endowment than any other museum in the world. So most of his personal estate, after legal battles and a lot of complications, finally passed to the trust in 1982. And drawing upon the vision of the Getty articulated in the trust entenditure, the trustees sought to make a greater contribution in the visual art by expanding the museums and its collection and creating a wide range of new programs and actually new institutions. So the trust actually acquired this parcel of land in Brentwood, which is actually basically an entire mountain, in 1983. And finally, in 1997, the Getty Center was open. Okay. And the Getty Center, so now the villa is still open, and the villa houses the antique collection of the museum. The rest of the collection is housed in this building. The whole thing was designed by Richard Meier. So this is the museum. This is the Research Institute, which is the library, archive, repositories, and research center. And this is the Conservation Institute, which is a an institute devoted to research in conservation and restoration. This is an image of the courtyard of the museum. It's also interesting to have a look at the development of the collection, and I'm going to be very brief. So this is how the collection looked like in 1977, when Getty was just passed. And this is how the collection looked in 1997 when the center opened. So there was an enormous growth, and the growth happened also in some areas of collecting that Getty was not interested at all, such as drawings, manuscripts, and photographs. Particularly, the photographic collection is really, really important, and it was born basically from the acquisition in 1984 of the Sam Wagstaff collection, which is one of the finest collection on the history of photography in the States. So I just want to finish spending 2 words about how we honor the legacy and the history of the museum at the Getty. As I said, the Getty Research Institute is a repository, first of all, of many archives about the life of Getty and about the life of the institution. We have all of J. Paul Getty's diaries that we have digitized. We have the Norman Neuerburg papers. We have some other papers about the construction of the villa, the construction of the center, and all the processing plan of Richard Meier. And also we have a lot of family papers. And then 2 years ago, we opened this permanent exhibition inside the museum, which is entitled Getty Life and Legacy, which is devoted to the history, to the life of J. Paul Getty and the history of the museum. So it's pretty interesting because there's a lot of audiovisual material, a lot of photos, installation shots, interviews to Getty, and stuff like that, together with a few selection from the collection, which highlights specific interest in Getty way of collecting and his understanding of art and what his museum would have to look like. So thank you very much.